John.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, let me ask Stephen Dougherty, who's Professor of American Literature and Culture at the University of Agder in Kristiansand, Norway. Stephen's academic interests include science fiction, media studies, psychoanalytic theory, science studies, immigrant fiction and migrant studies, phenomenology and globalization. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Adam.
A remote here to change the slide. Should be a little slow, but it reacts with some delay, but it will move forward to this one. No, give it the right arrow.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Let's see how it works. Thanks, everybody. Thanks. As I was interested to hear John say that he was surprised to be coming early, and I'm equally surprised to be coming early. I'm not a translation theorist, so I'm coming from all of this as a literary scholar. I'm not a linguist. I did buy a cognitive linguistics textbook that Adam recommended when he came to visit last year in Norway, where I teach, but I haven't gotten around to reading it yet. So I'm a literary scholar. But this is obviously very exciting things that are happening in translation theory and translation studies these days. So it's something that I'm really happy to be working on, even if as a kind of neophyte. I'm going to be reading too. John was talking about the value of slowness. I think I'm going to be privileging the value of speed, because I've got a few pages I want to get through. But I'll mainly be reading then this talk called Translation, Innovation, and Simulation. The subject for my discussion is innovation and translation, or how translation might be worthy of consideration as a powerful engine of innovation. But this project is also about simulation, or as Hillel Schwartz puts it in his eponymous book, The Culture of the Copy. Thus, the first question that arises is how we plot the relations among these three key terms: innovation, translation, and simulation. Part of what I want to argue is that simulation insinuates itself within the heart of any conceivable relation among these three terms. In The Culture of the Copy, Schwartz refers to the dubiousness of simulation, dilemmas of replication, disorders of repetition. The question he poses are those which have motivated the great thinkers of simulation over the last century: Ferdinand de Saussure, Sigmund Freud, Jacques Derrida, Jean Baudrillard. When he asks, is simulation a mode of insight or escape, recall or denial? It's not so different from Freud's ruminations on the pleasure principle. To mediate on these tightly clustered terms, innovation, translation, and simulation, is invariably to consider the role of language in human culture. By extension, such meditation opens onto the role of media technologies in the contemporary world. In our highly mediatized electronic cultures, innovation is bound together with simulation in ways that are often construed as disconcerting. Baudrillard's realm of the hyperreal is often the seed for dystopic imaginings, as in the Matrix films, where reality becomes simulation. Perhaps a Forbes magazine tech contributor writing that, quote, the future of innovation is simulation, counts as dystopic too. But what if we think of the future of innovation not as simulation, but as translation? Simulation itself is a kind of translation, a rendering of a pre-existing sign system, i.e. reality, that acquires a stability, a functionality, and a presence all its own. Similarly, translation is a kind of simulation, or at least it is if we assume that we no longer live in a world where the difference between the original and the copy is as meaningful as we once believed. Enter the role of genetics and genomics. In genetics, the synthesis of proteins, which is used in millions of cellular functions, is referred to as translation. The process of translation in genetics is the basis of life, aided by processes of transcription involving the production of RNA copies of genes. With genetics in mind, it's fair to claim that translation is indeed everywhere in nature. What about culture? In her acclaimed essay, Translation as Culture, we're going to see if this works now. No, not exactly. In her acclaimed essay, Translation as Culture, Spivak, Dr. Spivak glosses the
Space here.
Yeah. The psychoanalyst Melanie Klein's understanding of translation as constituting the central task of the psyche in its interface with the world. Spivak writes of the work of translation in Klein as an incessant shuttle that is a life. And here's the quote: "The human infant grabs on to some one thing and then things. This grabbing, begreifen, of an outside indistinguishable from an inside constitutes an inside going back and forth, encoding everything into a sign system by the things grasped. One can call this crude coding a translation," and so on. This constant moving backward and forward between the inside and the outside, self and other, this process of psychical reconstruction that Freud or Baudrillard or the Wachowski brothers would call simulation, Klein calls translation. It is a crude coding, a never-ending weaving, as Spivak puts it. Another way of naming the very work of self-constitution. Therefore, we are not talking about just any translation, but an originary translation, a phrase that points to the violence or negativity of self-constitution in Klein's psychoanalytics, and also to the violence, as Spivak points out, that Klein does to the very word translation and wrenching it away from its domestic range of dictionary definitions. The idea of an originary translation is one of the ways in which translation studies is currently being redefined. If simulation is everywhere, life is simulation, mind is simulation, so is translation. The underlying processes of translation in both nature and culture assume the existence of that which they make possible. And yet translation is perceived by some critics and theorists today, I would say many, as something fundamental. And this recognition is vital to the contemporary cultural and critical zeitgeist. There is nothing older than translation. Rebecca Walkowitz writes in a terrific book from 2015 called Born Translated, the contemporary novel on the age of world literature. This is in some ways a remarkable statement, but yet here I wish to emphasize its exemplarity. Some of what Walkowitz claims belongs to a rich critical heritage subversive of the cult of originality, and I would argue that its increased traction today is a result of significant interdisciplinary reinforcement and retooling of the message, which constitutes a kind of shuttling back and forth, a creation of self-constitution in Melanie Klein's sense, between contemporary discourses on biology and cultural theory. Thus another recent claim by the translator Carolyn Schreed posits translation as epigenesis, a key concept in biology, as well as post-Kantian philosophy. I'll return to this, but for now I want to stick with this central message. We must rethink the relation between original works and translations, just as we have been forced under the aegis of postmodernism and other provocations to rethink the relation between copies and originals. So what I'm going to be doing is talking a lot about what Adam was talking about in the beginning of the morning. The 16th century English writer and literary critic George Putnam announced in The Art of English Poesy that the true poets are makers, like God. He distinguished between original poems and copies, and he insisted that translators are not makers because they copy from pre-existing matter. We still think largely in these terms, established by early modern proponents of originality and then codified and popularized by the Romantics. Genetic styles of translation theory maintain the importance of the translation's fidelity to the original. However, in Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, a short story by Borges, Georges-Louis Borges, published in 1939, Borges would suggest something different, that the original might be unfaithful to the copy. Borges was a modernist who anticipated this postmodernist way of looking at things better than anyone. As N. Catherine Hales writes, rather than hoping for a common substratum that would provide the key to universal translation or evoking a pure language indistinguishable from the Word of God, Borges delighted in thinking of all writings as drafts in progress, imperfect instantiations. Thus in Borges' short story Pierre Menard, 20th century French language translations of fragments of the Quixote are incomparably more readable and more meaningful than Cervantes' original Don Quixote. After marveling over Menard's work, the narrator of Borges' story can no longer read Cervantes' Spanish language Quixote without imagining that Menard's is the original Quixote. Menard's fragmentary Quixote is more subtle than Cervantes' quote from the short story. The narrator insists, especially insofar as it gives the lie to the concept of the masterpiece. The timeless text, whose aesthetic clarity is eternally undiminished. Compared to Menard's work, there is something quote-unquote clumsy about Cervantes' Quixote. Menard's translation buzzes with invention, vigor, and originality. It is a living document shot through with the history of its own time, and therefore it is also transitory, fugitive. As a translator, as well as an artist, Menard, quote, anticipates the vanity awaiting all men's efforts. Yet, this is hardly the story's last word on translation. Oops. Borges writes, Menard, perhaps, without wanting to, has enriched by means of a new technique the halting and rudimentary act of reading. This new technique is that of the deliberate anachronism and the erroneous attribution. This technique, whose applications are infinite, prompts us to go through the Odyssey as if it were posterior to the Aeneid, and the book Le Jardin de Centaure of Madame Henri Bachelier as if it were by Madame Henri Bachelier, which is a terrific and very, very funny line. This technique fills the most placid works with adventure. Translation thus figures in Borges' story as a necessary as well as contingent act of reappropriation and renewal. It is as necessary for the art of reading as any individual work of translation is contingent in the history of world literature. Yet translation is invariably bound together with simulation, repetition, replication, a point which is strikingly emphasized in the narrator's line-by-line comparison of the two Quixotes near the end of the story. The narrator quotes Menard, who writes, "Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future's counselor." Then he quotes Cervantes' corresponding lines. "Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past," and so on. They're exactly the same. In his original Spanish language version of the story, one can imagine that Borges might have chosen to render Menard's translation in French, since in the telling of the tale he composes it in French. Presenting both passages in identical Spanish language clauses powerfully underscores the idea of translation as repetition, as copy. Nevertheless, the narrator begs us to observe the difference, the stark contrast in style between Menard's revelatory prose and Cervantes' labored affectations. Same language, nevertheless, very, very different interpretations of the language. The moral of the tale is that the reader makes the meaning, and that the reader's specific location in time and space, as well as her uniquely personal and essentially generic qualities of belongingness to language, is critical for meaning-making. Translation is simulation, but with a vital living difference born of the temporal and cultural linguistic gap that is part of the structure of historicity itself, as well as that of the relation among languages. This comparative aspect of the Borgesian concept of translation is crucial. The original is hopeless without the translation. Borges' confounding of copies and originals, translations, and monuments is today being taken up and promoted as a motive force for literary production and circulation. Translations can be originals, so the lesson goes, and admiration for the work of the translator is really not so strange. Borges' admiration for Menard is echoed, for example, in Nobel Prize-winning author Kazuo Ishiguro's admiration for David Megershack. Now, born in Riga at the end of the 19th century, which was then part of Russia, and naturalized as a British citizen in 1931, Megershack was a biographer of Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Chekhov, Gogol, and Pushkin. He translated some of these canonical Russian writers into English, too. His translations of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment from 1951, The Idiot from 1956, and The Brothers Karamazov from 1958 would become standard English language works for decades, and Ishiguro was a really big fan of these books. As he stated in a 2005 interview, quoted in Walkowitz's Born Translated, quote, "Often, when people ask me who my big influences are, I feel I should say David Nagershak, a translator, because I think the rhythm of my own prose is very much like those Russian translations that I read." Walkowitz notes, quote, "Ishiguro values not just any Dostoevsky, but Nagershak's Dostoevsky, and he seems to appreciate the idea that his own novels are imitating translations. For Ishiguro, Nagershak's translations are original works of art in their own right, to be treasured just as Borges' narrator treasures Minard. They are original translations. But Walkowitz wishes to press the matter and drive the lesson to its conclusion. If translations can be originals, originals can be copies. Ishiguro's novels are strikingly distinctive works that assume the rhythms and textures of translations, or copies. This is how Ishiguro himself sees it, and it is what Walkowitz argues in Born Translated. Indeed, it's what she means by Born Translated. Ishiguro's novels demand translation by, quote, acknowledging the multiple contexts of their making and remaking, by incorporating comparison, and by thematizing the work of comparison. Never Let Me Go, this is a novel of Ishiguro's from 2005. This is one of the critical focal points in Walkowitz's chapter on Ishiguro. Published in 2005 in English and multiple other languages, German, Dutch, Danish, and something else in the first year alone. The novel is explicitly about our conceptualization of the relationship between copy and original. It's a science fictional story, Never Let Me Go, set in alternate history England of the 1990s. The narrator, Kathy H., recounts in flat, affectless language her experiences and memories of a special school called Hailsham, where she was a caregiver in years earlier. The children in the school are all clones, and so is Kathy H. And they are reared so that their vital organs can be harvested in their early adulthood, and then they'll soon die after that. The plot of the novel connects the mystery surrounding the systematic collection of the artwork that the children are compelled to produce under the supervision of the teachers and the headmistress at this school, Hailsham. The reader discovers, not unexpectedly, that this art is one of the main ways that people's capacities for interiority and individuality are measured. In fact, it is through the archiving of what the humans officially and mechanically deem unoriginal art that the donation system is perpetuated. The fact that the collected art is pretty unoriginal is beside the point. In not really bothering to compare, the humans can persist in seeing themselves as unique and the clones as mere copies or simulations. Never Let Me Go is filled with the flotsam of popular culture. The title refers to a bland pop song Kathy H. remembers from her youth at Hailsham, and to a cassette recording of the song, or multiple copies of the cassette, multiple cassettes, to which she becomes emotionally attached at different points in her youth. As Walkowitz suggests, this unsettling novel does not try to make us see that clones are like humans, nearly so much as it tries to make us see that humans are like clones. We'll try that. That's it. Okay, here's the quotation. That is, this is Walkowitz, we are urged to see that even humans produced through biological reproduction are in some ways copies, and that human culture, full of cassette tapes and television programs and rumors and paperbacks of Daniel Germando, is also unoriginal. It is by seeing the likeness between human originality and the novel's unoriginal objects, Kathy H., the cassette, the song, the narration, that we recognize the large networks of approximation and comparison in which individuality functions. It is within such networks of approximation and comparison that translation functions as well. Now, not thinking comparatively, perpetuating romantic idealizations of originality is unethical. In Never Let Me Go, it, quote, leads to killing clones and preserving people. Likewise, perpetuating romantic notions of the uniqueness of national literatures is unethical. If our aim is to envision a global culture that is, this is quoting Walkowitz, something other than an enlargement of national culture, close quote, comparison is crucial. But this emphasis on comparison entails something else, and that is recognizing the distinctive value of of what Walkowitz calls unoriginality. Practically speaking, this simply means following through on the comparative premises that Walkowitz lays out. It means recognizing that literary production and circulation in the modern period has always been about engendering certain kinds of collectivities. Abjuring the cult of originality would allow us to imagine new kinds of communities of authors and readers, new forms of collaboration, new ideologies of the literary, focusing on the importance of reception, how, quote, the content of art is transformed by expansive circulation and by the local interpretations that readers impose. On this alternative model, the power of literature is based on social relationships it helps to create, not on what a literary text is in and of itself, as if a work of literature ever could exist in some pure state outside of its social embeddedness. As for uniqueness and originality, these do not disappear from the world, as Walkowitz writes, with Ishigeru's novels specifically in mind, but they persist, quote, only in comparative forms, in the shape of the echo, the copy, the clone, the list, the series, and the translation. This style of thinking about the relation between copies and originals is not new, but it is currently in the ascendant. It's certainly a part of the postmodern or postmodern dispensation, and there are significant consequences for translation theory. In Original Copy, Plagiarism and Originality in 19th Century Literature, a book by Robert McFarland from 2007, McFarland discusses Paul Valéry's letter about Mallarmé in order to drive home a point that bears directly on the question of how we value translation. I'm going to try this one more time. This is the quote from McFarland's book. For Valéry, all literature is irredeemably second-hand. Originality is not an indwelling quality of writerly production, but instead a function of readerly perception, or more precisely, readerly ignorance, a failure to discern a writer's sources. Writing is a continual process of tuning out, réfuter, turning up, amplifier, or fine-tuning, raffiner, what someone else has done, and all writers thus either inhabit or inhibit the language of others. The translator's labor is not unlike the labor of the non-translator, who likewise takes in language inputs and produces language, invariably bearing the traces of source materials. If only the reader is careful enough to recognize this. For Valéry, this is the very nature of the art of writing, for the translator and the non-translator alike. Indeed, what is most remarkable about Valéry's letter about Mallarmé is how he positions the translator as the exemplary writer. All writing turns out to be a kind of translation. There is still creativity, but that is a function of the recombinative work of tuning out, turning up, and fine-tuning, not of conjuring something out of nothing. Of course, we cannot fail to recognize that if translation is like other kinds of writings, it is different too. What is special about this moment in the history of criticism and literary theory is the manner in which the kinds of recombinative theoretics that McFarland surveys in the mid and late Victorian periods, having arisen in anxious response to Romanticism's cult of originality, are being used for the sake of promoting claims specifically about translation. All writing is not translation, because translation is a very special kind of writing. Walkowitz is emphatic on this point. She writes, translation, she writes very memorably at the beginning of her book, translation is the engine rather than the caboose of literary history. No one was saying that in the Victorian period, as far as I know. Borges comes close in his late modernist parable Minar, and for that matter, perhaps Joyce, James Joyce, proves it in literary performance better than anyone ever has in Finnegan's Wake, also from 1939, the same year as Borges' Pierre Menard. To think of translation as the engine of innovation in literary history entails a widening of our analytic horizon and a consequent readjustment of our basic concepts of literature and language. For one thing, it means recognizing that all languages exist in a continuum. They exist in the plural, in their multiplicity, and in their relatedness. They belong together, and they cannot be what they are or will become outside of their belongingness. We can say more or less the same thing about humans as language users, defined as we are by our drive to communicate with one another and creatively express ourselves, within and across languages, time, space, and cultural practices. This style of thinking opens onto metaphoric figurations of translation that necessarily involve the image of the global systems, global networks, etc. In so doing, it also elicits biological metaphors. And in conclusion, I want to offer one such biological metaphor. If we think for a moment in a Benjaminian way of the world's languages as constituting a giant brain, then the work of translation is like the activity of synaptic connection, without which groups of neurons can neither fire nor wire together. Translation is that synaptic cleft across which potential flows. Without it, there is no consciousness. Without translation, there is no world literature. There are no literary arts. One final biological metaphor, which connects very appropriately with the central figure of reproduction in this talk. Carolyn Shreed, who I mentioned earlier, who's translated into English 4 books by the French philosopher Catherine Malabou, writes in her translator's foreword to Malabou's Before Tomorrow, Epigenesis and Rationality. This is a book from 2016. Carolyn Shreed writes, "For our part, as translation theorists, we have been thinking translation in genetic terms and therefore failing to account for our or recognize epigenetic productivity. Yet translation is epigenesis," Carolyn Shreed writes. Translation is that process in which the text self-differentiates and thereby grows, develops, and matures. She begins her foreword with this epigraph from Malabou's book. "Tomorrow, the order of precedence between program and its translation will be inverted." And that's the French philosopher Catherine Malabou, who was a wonderful writer and thinker. And so she has the last